Given the very name of this YouTube channel, it should serve as no surprise that I like Half-Life. A lot. So naturally, it must stand to reason that I enjoyed Half-Life Alyx, right? I mean, all of this universal praise must mean that this game is objectively great, right? Well, I'm not so sure about that. I realize I'm walking into the most negative backlash imaginable, and I don't know how I can say this in a way that can assure everyone of my sincerity. I can only say that Half-Life Alyx is the most negative gaming experience I have ever been through. Playing this game put me through physical and mental agony. And so, in spite of all of the unanimous universal praise, I felt that I had to say something. I had to make a video to give voice to the discussion, to explain why Half-Life Alyx is such a flawed game, if for no other reason than to assure my own sanity. Thus, my critique of Half-Life Alyx. This is going to be a long video which I've decided to break into multiple parts. For the sake of watchability, links to these parts will be in the description. But before I start, I feel like I need to address a few caveats. I do not hate virtual reality. I don't particularly like it, but I don't hate it either. It is a perfectly legitimate artistic medium. And if you enjoyed Half-Life Alyx, if you truly believe it was a great VR game, then great, I'm happy for you. But just because you like a thing does not make said thing above criticism. On the other hand, if you truly dislike virtual reality, then that is also okay. You should feel free to express that opinion, as long as that expression doesn't devolve into harassment or doxing or death threats or any other such nonsense. I also need to briefly address Valve itself. Because I understand that in any company there are the leaders, the shot callers, and there are the doers. And despite all of this talk of a flat management structure, Valve is no different. Now, I don't have much positive to say about Valve in this video. But if you were one of the doers for the project of Half-Life Alyx, then let it be known that I do not hate you, and I do not blame you. Because when I say that Half-Life Alyx is a flawed game, that does not mean it is a totally incompetent game, unlike certain other titles. It is a perfectly playable game with a great deal of production value, and I am certain that production value has everything to do with the work of artists, programmers, voice actors who had nothing to do with the creative decisions behind Alyx. So again, if you were one of those people, I don't blame you, and I thank you for all of your hard work. To be clear, whenever I say the word Valve, know that I'm referring to strictly the leadership within Valve, the creative heads who believed that this game was a good idea, because almost all of my ire should be directed at them alone. Lastly, I'll mention a few technical points. I played this game on a first-generation HTC Vive, within a playable room scale space that was slightly smaller than the minimum requirements, so it could be said that I didn't quite have the most optimal experience. That said, despite me saying that this game put me through physical agony, that had nothing to do with motion sickness, despite this being the first VR game I've played in a long time, which was a pleasant surprise. I did see some reduction in framerate in the later half of the game, which did put something of a damper on my experience. Also, I would like to apologize for some of the quality of these recordings. This was my first time recording a VR game, so I had to cut out some of the bottom pieces of my earlier recordings. In most other cases, I would probably go back and re-record that footage. But in this case, I will not, because I really do not want to play this game again. And on that note, let us begin with our critique. First off, let's take a step back and try to answer the question of, why was Half-Life so good? Some people may give the obvious answers of, it was a campaign with great pacing, or it was a game that pushed the technology of gaming. But I argue that the former reason is a bit inadequate, and the latter reason is only a critique that works retroactively. Yet I firmly believe that by the standards of today, Half-Life still holds up. So why is that the case? To really answer this, we need to get into some of the deeper topics of game design. In my first video, I already mentioned most of these topics, but for the sake of clarity, I'll go ahead and summarize them again here. And I know what people are going to say. Oh, you use big made-up words, you're so pretentious, armchair game developer. But for the purposes of understanding games, these concepts matter to me. So like it or not, we're going to talk about this stuff. Firstly, we have the topics of interactivity and ergodicity. Interactivity is fairly simple. Basically just means a game has interactive elements which provide some meaningful choices. But ergodicity is the big concept here. It's basically the notion that a player must exist for a game's narrative to be complete, and that a player must apply effort to push a narrative to completion. I argue that every video game combines these concepts to some extent. But in reality, many games or many sequences within games tend to lean upon one concept or another. A game with interactivity but no ergodicity might just be a sandbox game with a lot of stuff in it. Contrariwise, a game with ergodicity but no interactivity might simply be a hyperlinear scripted sequence of a game. I argue that Half-Life maintains a consistent balance between these two ideas. Half-Life 1 did this through careful world building. Half-Life 2 added the potential for physics, but also enabled the physics to become relevant to the gameplay at large, through a single unifying game mechanic, that mechanic being the gravity gun. So we have interactivity in the physics, but also ergodicity in the gravity gun, in how it enables physics in both puzzles and combat. There's also the two concepts of abstraction and diegesis, which basically refers to how a work of art communicates information. In any story, you might convey information in either an abstract fashion or a literal, aka diegetic fashion. In my previous video, I discussed how these two concepts relate to the process of immersion, and to create immersion, you must maintain a balance between the diegetic and the abstract. Half-Life maintains this balance via two factors. The first factor is by allowing Gordon Freeman to be an avatar for the player to inhabit. The other factor is by not adding game mechanics without good reasons. In other words, the game mechanics should feel somewhat explained by the game's narrative. The result is something I've called diegetic immersion, which again I've talked all about in my previous video. So we have all of these big concepts of interactivity, ergodicity, abstraction, and diegesis all intermingling with one another. Yet Half-Life maintains a balance between all of these concepts. I won't say the Half-Life games are perfect, they certainly are not, but I believe because of this they remain incomparable to most other game franchises out there. Sure, you may have similar looking games, like your Halos, your Metros, your System Shocks, and so on, games with similar gameplay, similar sci-fi motifs and themes, but they cannot quite match the balance of Half-Life. Off the top of my head, the only other game which I could say compares to Half-Life might be a game like Riven, which lies within a completely different subgenre of games. But all this discussion is relative to flat-screen games. With the advent of virtual reality, this discussion changes quite a bit. You may recall earlier that I said that virtual reality is a legitimate artistic medium, and I continue to stand by that conclusion. But I hear a lot of VR enthusiasts coming to the conclusion of, VR is the best thing ever, you must be blind if you don't see the potential of VR. That is completely fallacious, simply for the reason that artistic evolution is not a straight line. Every artistic medium has its own strengths and weaknesses, and none are objectively better than any other. If that were the case, media of books and theater might have died out years ago. And every person is going to have their own preferred artistic medium. So I can sit here on my YouTuber soapbox extolling the virtues of video games until I'm blue in the face, yet someone like my mother is always going to prefer the medium of books. And that has nothing to do with being a Luddite or a boomer or other such nonsense. It's just a matter of personal preference, and that's fine. Every medium has its upsides and downsides, and until Gaben himself ushers in the existential apocalypse of brain chips, that will always be the case. But here's where we begin to have problems, because Half-Life has always been regarded by many, including Valve itself, to be those games that push technology forward. I wholeheartedly disagree. Half-Life was not great because it pushed technology. It was great because it codified the idea of an ergodic narrative within video games. But let's assume for the moment that I am wrong and that VR is the future. If we are going to analyze Half-Life Alyx, we'll need to ask ourselves two big questions. Either, does Half-Life Alyx maintain the balance of previous games in terms of interactivity, ergodicity, and so on? Or does Half-Life Alyx elevate the upsides of VR whilst diminishing the downsides? If we can answer yes to one of these questions, then I think we can say that Half-Life Alyx is good on some level. Is that the case? Let's find out. I'm going to start this discussion with a few nitpicks, which I have chosen because they all relate back to that concept of diegesis. Starting off with the user interface, health and ammo counters are now portrayed as physical readouts on Alyx's gloves, which is a good thing. I do like that. The tutorials, though, I'm not so fond of those. Now I can mostly forgive this because VR is a new medium, and because not a lot of people are going to be familiar with VR controls. But what I find less forgivable is how these pop-ups occur during other pieces of dialogue, and the fact that we still get pop-up messages about how to vault and how to jump even in the later half of the game is still a tad insulting. Okay, so this next opinion is going to get me lynched by all of the VR developers out there. I'm not a big fan of the whole floaty hands design. And I know the knee-jerk reaction is going to be something like, well, in the Half-Life games, you could never see Gordon's legs. Why should you complain about not being able to see Alyx's arms? To which I reply that, the medium of flat-screen games is inherently more abstract than the medium of virtual reality. The nature of VR implies that you can embody an entirely different character. So when a VR game can't represent your character's body, it proposes a diegesis problem of, am I a character or am I a camera with two floating hands? Now I get that part of the problem is a matter of technology, which is a fair enough excuse to not show Alyx's arms. But I do feel that as virtual reality progresses, the technology will improve enough to overcome these hurdles. When that happens, a game like Boneworks, which completely embodies the player, should stand the test of time, whereas a game like Half-Life Alyx might become dated a decade from now. The biggest diegesis problem in Half-Life Alyx would have to be your methods of locomotion. In any VR game, if you are trying to create a long single-player campaign, you're going to run into the issue that the player cannot diegetically move too far in any one direction. In my mind, there are only really 3 solutions to this problem. You could have option A, where you keep the experience focused to a vehicle or a cockpit. Option B, where you make teleportation the primary mode of locomotion, but also explain the teleportation diegetically within the game's universe, like with some kind of wrist-mounted portal gun. Or option C, where you employ alternate modes of locomotion by using your hands, which doesn't necessarily fix the diegesis problem, but ultimately distracts from the problem enough to create a novel feeling of exploration. Half-Life Alyx does not attempt any of these solutions. The closest we get to a novel type of locomotion is being able to manually climb ladders, which is entirely optional. Obviously, the intent here was to try to maintain some level of accessibility, which I can definitely respect. But at the end of the day, the most effective means of traversal is simply to use the teleport and quick turn functions, which I think ultimately cheapens the experience. In a weird way, it's sort of a regression back to the 90s era of Myst-style adventure games. Anyway, with all of that nitpicking aside, what is the core gameplay of Half-Life Alyx about? Ultimately, it comes down to explore, gather resources, upgrade weapons, fight enemies. Seems simple enough, but if you look closely enough, then some major issues begin to show themselves. In order to articulate what I'm talking about, I have to discuss 2 more concepts. Yes, I know, more super pretentious garbage. Bear with me though, because this all ties back into those concepts of interactivity and ergodicity I mentioned before. The first topic is that of token mechanics. This is an idea where the game developer has devised some unique type of interactivity, but has been unable to find a compelling reason to put it into the game's narrative. So ultimately, they end up forcing this interactivity into the gameplay. In other words, it's forced interactivity at the cost of ergodicity. A perfect example of this can be found in Half-Life 2, which may sound surprising, because didn't I just explain how the gravity gun was able to tie together these interactive and ergodic elements of Half-Life 2? Keep in mind, though, that you don't actually have the gravity gun until you reach Black Mesa East, which means you have 2 full gameplay-focused chapters where you don't have the power of the gravity gun. Now here it's obvious that Valve wanted to showcase their new, exciting physics for Half-Life 2, but were unable to find a compelling reason to put the physics into the story. Ultimately, they decided to add these forced token physics puzzles, to the effect of, hey, we've got new physics in this game, come check out our awesome physics puzzles. And sure, these puzzles may have been interesting pieces of interactivity way back in 2004, but in terms of the ergodic narrative, that idea of Gordon's escape from City 17, in the end, these physics puzzles do not serve that narrative in any way. It is no surprise that once you acquire the gravity gun, these physics puzzles become fewer and further between, and are completely non-existent by the time you lay siege to Nova Prospekt. The second big idea I want to talk about is that of contrived linearity. It's the notion that the game designer is forcing the player to experience a singular narrative, at the cost of being unable to showcase existing gameplay within this story. In other words, it is the conceptual opposite of token mechanics. It is forcing ergodicity at the cost of interactivity. You could say Half-Life 2 has some of this, but for me, the biggest example lies within the Portal games. Anyone who has played Portal will know that the gameplay is focused upon the Portal gun itself. Much like the gravity gun in Half-Life 2, the Portal gun serves to tie together those elements of interactivity and ergodicity. That being, navigating the portals, and solving the test chambers respectively. However, Portal, and especially Portal 2, has these long sequences where you're not solving puzzles, but rather you're trying to simply navigate your way through the facility. It often comes down to, you've got a white patch of wall here and a white patch of wall there. Oh gee, what a puzzle. I do so wonder where I'm supposed to put my portals. You get the idea. Valve tried to make sequences which tell an interesting story, but it came at the cost of the novelty of the portal gun itself. So what's the point of all of this pretentious nonsense? Why does any of this matter? Well, it's because Half-Life Alyx has both of these problems. On the one hand, this game has the problem of token mechanics, by virtue of having these awful holographic minigames. Here's a good rule of thumb. If a puzzle is instantly recognizable as a puzzle, then it is a bad puzzle, which has nothing to do with the intrinsic difficulty of the puzzle, but everything to do with the fact that the game designer could not find a compelling way to integrate this puzzle into the game's world or the game's narrative. If we go back to Half-Life 2, I'd say that this one puzzle in Episode 2 is head and shoulders above every wiring puzzle in Half-Life Alyx, simply because you are literally moving these cables around. It is ultimately a kinesthetic experience. By that I mean you are having an authentic, tangible interaction with the game world, which you'd think ought to be the major objective of virtual reality. Even so, I'd say that in Alyx there are at most 3 or 4 puzzles which emulate this level of reality. Though that's not to say that any of the puzzles in Half-Life Alyx are remotely challenging. The gameplay here is literally at the childish level of connect the dots. And sure, these puzzles may be novel in that they could not be possible on flat-screen games. Most of them are still, by definition, token puzzles. They still only exist to justify their own existence. At the same time, however, Half-Life Alyx has contrived linearity, where it proposes the illusion of a physics sandbox, but ultimately forces you to play the game in one specific way. A textbook example of this is when you acquire a shotgun from a zombie hanging from a ceiling. Now here I am thinking, well here's an interesting puzzle scenario. I wonder how I can solve this. In the end, I would be quite disappointed. Because you cannot pull the shotgun from the zombie's hand, you can't knock it out of his hand, you cannot shoot the rope that's holding him to the ceiling. The only thing you can do is mess around with this crank mechanism until the zombie is at the right height for you to grab that shotgun. This is not a physics sandbox, because you must play the game exactly as Valve intended. This type of shallowness and imbalance of game design plagues Half-Life Alyx. Of particular interest to me is how the realms of exploration and combat seldom mix. A tool for exploration, like the multi-tool, can never be used in combat, and Alyx's guns, by and large, cannot be used for solving puzzles. Even the gravity gloves, which seem intended to bridge that gap, are ultimately weaker than their Half-Life 2 counterpart of the gravity gun. The only bit of gameplay which ties together the exploration and the combat would be the upgrade system. Now, on a hypothetical level, the notion of weapon upgrades in virtual reality has a great deal of potential. But here's how it works in Half-Life Alyx. Stick your gun into the machine, push a button for the upgrade you want, slot some chunks of resin into the machine, and then pull your finalized gun out of the machine. Yet another dull interface we've seen before in other games. But how do you acquire those chunks of resin, you might ask? Well, you just gotta find them in the world, which might be fine in and of itself. But here's the thing. This being a virtual reality game, Valve has given most props in the world some level of interactivity. Yet those chunks of resin you're looking for will only be hidden behind some of those props. But you, the player, don't know where to look for that resin. So in the end, the process of exploration ultimately boils down to searching behind every cupboard, every bit of trash, every prop, everywhere, over and over again, just to find those all-important chunks of resin to upgrade your weapons. But since 90% of the time, these props won't be hiding resin, this process of exploration ultimately becomes a huge waste of time. Again, it's all these pieces of interactivity, yet ultimately they are lacking in ergodicity. Compare this to a flat-screen game like Prey 2017, which not only has a multitude of items that are relevant to the crafting process, but also has the handy-dandy tool of the recycler grenade. With this one tool, every prop, every bit of furniture, every piece of trash can be made relevant to the crafting process of that game. And furthermore, it can also be used in combat. Back to Half-Life Alyx, my other big complaint about exploration is that the world is filled with cul-de-sacs. These forced cul-de-sacs give the illusion of complex exploration, but again ultimately make me feel like I'm wasting my time. I'd say the only time where exploration is actually interesting is when you have to collect keycards to open certain doors. But even here, we bump into the issue that these keycards take up precious inventory slots. Not only does this limit the complexity of exploration, but ultimately forces you to drop items, which again encourages more backtracking and more time wasting. At this point, you may have noticed that I've mentioned the notion of wasting time a lot in this review. Well, rest assured, it's going to be a major theme in Half-Life Alyx. But what about the combat? Does the combat in Half-Life Alyx provide a unique VR experience? I'd say definitely not. See, here's the thing. Half-Life Alyx is not Boneworks. There are no dedicated melee weapons in Alyx. And unlike Boneworks, melee combat is, by and large, a non-option. It is for this reason alone that I say that Half-Life Alyx is not a pure physics sandbox, but rather an adaptation of the first-person shooter subgenre into virtual reality. This is a substantial problem, because I claim that virtual reality cannot provide a satisfying kinesthetic experience of shooting firearms. Again, take note of that keyword of kinesthetics, which ought to be a core advantage of VR. But for gunplay to be satisfying, you usually need 3 pillars of gameplay. You have movement, which provides the experience of dodging enemies and dodging attacks. Recoil, which creates a skill-based element of handling your firearms. And reloading, which I'd argue is somewhat boring, but does force you to consider the other guns and tools at your disposal. The old Half-Life games, as basic as their gunplay was, did manage to maintain a balance between all of these systems. But now that Half-Life Alyx is forcing us into the realm of VR, these elements start to have a few issues. Now, on the one hand, movement is less impactful in Alyx, simply because of the slowness of moving around in VR, and because of all of the problems of locomotion I mentioned earlier. On the other hand, any concept of recoil is simply non-existent, because VR controllers are simply unable to push back against your hand in order to emulate that feel of gunplay. The most pointed example I can think of is Alyx's one-handed shotgun. If Alyx were to shoot that gun in real life, she would have broken her wrist 10 times over. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that virtual reality should literally provide the experience of breaking your own arm. Yet, at the same time, I can't help but feel that this is an advantage of the flat-screen games over VR. They can emulate the experience of wielding these big, badass guns without the demand of you risking personal injury. Now, at this point, I'm sure all of the naysayers are screaming at me. But what about the reloading? The reloading is totally diegetic now. Why are you complaining so much? And yes, that is true. The act of reloading in Half-Life Alyx is now completely diegetic and kinesthetic, which is admirable. But from a gameplay perspective, trying to make reloading better is on the level of trying to polish a turd. Keep in mind that when you make reloading such a detailed process, you're going to draw the player's attention away from the combat, which can lead to a lot of frustration. And given that there are only 3 weapons in Half-Life Alyx, this frustration is going to happen a lot more often. Now combine all of that with the fact that the inputs of virtual reality do not allow you to multitask, at least not on the level of flat-screen games. The result is that in any particular combat scenario, you are either shooting, reloading, or moving, but almost never a combination of those 3. So in the end, the best strategy for Half-Life Alyx is to simply stick to a piece of cover and take pot shots, which is the most boring style of combat in any first-person shooter. And if you ever find yourself out of position, there's really nothing you can do except retreat. At the same time, since Alyx has the magical power of teleportation, it is far too easy to retreat, thereby forcing the enemies to come at you one by one, which once again turns the combat into more connect the dots, and less of an actual fight for survival. Now at this point, if you've been paying attention, then you've likely come to the same conclusion that I have. Both that Half-Life Alyx fails to maintain that crucial balance of game design that the past Half-Life games achieved, and that the choice to adapt a first-person shooter into VR has ultimately failed to create a compelling kinesthetic experience. In other words, it fails to truly live up to the advantages of VR. The question we now have to ask would be, are there any positive elements within Half-Life Alyx that can save the experience? I already mentioned how the process of upgrading your weapons was dull and uninspired. As for the upgrades themselves, they are less than exciting. Essentially, they are not upgrades to elevate your playstyles, but rather upgrades to make the guns more convenient to use. Laser sights and extended magazines provide the most utility, while the reflex sights are kind of useless. The most substantial upgrade in the game would be the grenade launcher mod for the shotgun, merely because it allows you to bypass the 2 inventory slot limit in terms of how many grenades you're allowed to carry. But what about the enemy design? Again, I say less than spectacular. In any FPS game, I think it is a reasonable enough conclusion that you ought to reward skillful gameplay whenever possible. But Half-Life Alyx does not do this, or at least it does so inconsistently. Zombies are a great example of what I'm talking about. Zombies in Half-Life 2 obeyed this principle of rewarding skill.
My advice to you is, aim for the head.
Shoot a zombie in the body, and the head crab will detach itself looking for a new host. But shoot a zombie in the head, and you will kill both the zombie and the creature responsible for creating that zombie. A perfectly logical, sensible manner of rewarding skill. But Half-Life Alyx violates this principle. Playing on normal difficulty, a zombie will take 5 pistol shots to the head, but once he goes down, the head crab will still get back up for no other reason besides randomness. So that's 3 more shots to kill this head crab, which should already be dead. If you've been doing the math so far, that's 8 rounds expended of your 10-round magazine. Even if you don't miss a shot, at this time you will already be contemplating a reload. Now some zombies do have these green tumors which can be shot for a one-shot kill, but relying upon this mechanic is seldom a reliable strategy. Some zombies have armored head crabs. These guys cannot even be taken down with headshots. You must shoot these guys in the body, and then wait for the head crab to show his weak spot. And remember that weak spot is the only way to kill those armored head crabs. That is not rewarding skill. That is forcing the player to get good, which, in practice, is ultimately a waste of time. Combine soldiers are not much better. Even when aiming for the head, these guys are serious bullet sponges. Some soldiers do have these fuel tanks you can hit for a one-hit kill, but again, that is seldom a reliable strategy. Some soldiers will spawn in manhacks, which forces you to focus on the manhacks instead of the soldiers, which is, again, wasting time. And then you have the minigunners and shotgunners. The former will suppress you with their heavy firepower. The latter will raise an impenetrable shield. The only strategy for these guys is to hide behind cover and wait for them to lower their defenses, which, once again, is wasting time. Not even a direct hit from a grenade can provide the decency of a one-hit kill. The third enemy type in this game would be the antlions, which, okay, these guys were somewhat enjoyable. I'd still hesitate to call them actually good for all of the reasons I mentioned before about not being able to multitask in combat. The whole dismemberment concept was rather novel, and fighting these guys did not feel like a huge waste of time. But for every positive, there is a negative, and here we have to discuss the lightning dogs. The worst design for an enemy I have ever seen in any Valve game. At the basic level, these guys are only bullet sponges that will throw lightning at you and run away, which is less than ideal. But soon we find out that these guys can infect corpses, turning them into lightning zombies. In order to kill a lightning zombie, you must shoot the weak spots, wait for him to wind up an electrical attack, shoot the weak spots again, until finally this lightning dog gets out of the body, and only then are you allowed to do meaningful damage to finally kill this creature. None of this provides any sort of challenge whatsoever. It is only a waste of time. And if that weren't bad enough, you get to fight 2 lightning dogs. At this stage, I let out the biggest groan of frustration because I knew exactly what was going to happen. But for the sake of thoroughness, let's break down this fight. The objective here is to kill these 2 lightning dogs, which you must accomplish in order to move forward. Now the moment you jump into this pit, the lightning dogs will go into hiding and the game will spawn in some zombies. Now you cannot immediately hunt down these lightning dogs, because these zombies will be getting in your way, so you have to kill the zombies. But now we have the problem of all of these corpses on the ground, ready to be infected by these lightning dogs. So here I am thinking, well, if I can just deny these creatures from infecting these corpses, then I can save myself a lot of time. But that strategy is not an option. You cannot remove these corpses from the battlefield, because you can only carry one at a time, and if you go to move one, then the lightning dogs will just infect another one. You cannot camp on the corpses because the lightning dogs are in hiding. You cannot flush the lightning dogs out of hiding because you do not have any grenades in the vicinity. And even if you did, these creatures will run away from your grenades 90% of the time, which means you have to hunt down these lightning dogs, which means these creatures will always infect one of these corpses, which means you have to fight one of these lightning zombies at all times. And at this moment, the game also decides to spawn in some regular zombies, which means you are distracted from fighting these lightning zombies, which means the odds of these guys pulling off a lightning attack is far more likely. And, to top it all off, if these guys successfully hit you with a lightning attack, you are completely immobilized. Because loss of control effects are totally an awesome idea for any first-person shooter, right guys? Once more, you must play the game exactly as Valve intended. Any critique of Half-Life Alyx would not be complete without a discussion of the set pieces, and so here we have to discuss Jeff. Oh, sweet Jeff, what a complete bastard you were. The gimmick of this encounter is that Jeff is a monster that responds to sounds, which means you're required to tiptoe around, covering your mouth, to stop coughing, and to use glass bottles to distract the monster. I realize some people out there will think that this encounter was a stroke of genius. I absolutely hated it, because it had nothing to do with any of the weapons or tools at your disposal, save for maybe the gravity gloves and the occasional wiring puzzle. It is not a gameplay sandbox, but rather a highly scripted encounter. Observe this moment where both Jeff and I are in this elevator, and I try to shoot this button with my pistol. Of course it does not work, but do observe how this monster, who is supposedly sensitive to sound, is not even aroused by my gunfire. Adding further insult to injury would be the fact that this encounter is filled with what I call newbie traps. Here I define newbie trap as any component of the exploration which punishes you for carelessly manipulating objects in the world. This issue is not specific to the encounter with Jeff, but it is the most prominent here. Take a wrong step, open a wrong door, or move the wrong object, and you'll be breaking another bottle of alcohol, thereby attracting more attention to yourself. The absolute worst example of a newbie trap is this wiring puzzle. Oh, what's that? You want to try to quickly solve this puzzle? Screw you. You just triggered a very loud alarm, and now our good friend Jeff is coming to eat your face off. Wow, what a big mistake you made. Don't you feel just completely stupid? Now you might provide the critique that this encounter is no different from the Antlion Guardian encounter from episode 2, but I disagree strongly. First of all, I find that a monster that knows where you are is always going to be more interesting than a monster you have to be perpetually tiptoeing around. Secondly, after all of the tedious running around in Episode 2, that game granted you the courtesy of killing the Antlion Guardian, with all of the weapons and physics tools at your disposal. Half-Life Alyx provides no such courtesy. After all of the tedious jump scares, the pointless newbie traps, the boring backtracking and rule of 3 fetching batteries for a generator, you finally lure Jeff into a trash compactor, push a button, and then Jeff is mercilessly killed off-screen. Thus, the grand encounter with Jeff ends with all of the impact of a soggy fart. At this point, I might as well mention the other set pieces in this game. There are 2 sequences where you have to avoid a bunch of explosives, which is just a retread of that hangar in Half-Life 1, except worse, because of how tedious the exploration is in this game. The final boss fight is an encounter with a Strider, which is a retread of the climax of Episode 1, except worse, because in that game, you killed that Strider with your own rocket launcher. Whereas in Alyx, the game just gives you a big turret and says, you better kill that Strider before he kills you. Lastly, there's the endgame sequence, where you lose all of your weapons, but guess what? Your gravity gloves are super powered, and now you can launch these super powerful lightning balls at the enemy. Which is, once more, a retread of the ending of Half-Life 2, but worse, because it is actually possible to run out of these green lightning balls. And, since this is a low-gravity environment, some of your shots are bound to be blocked by corpses or pieces of debris hanging in the air. So, to try to wrap up this discussion regarding gameplay, there is one moment in the game which stuck out in my mind more than any other. It is this moment early in the game where Eli is about to fall to his death. Now here I am thinking that maybe I could actually rescue Eli, that I could actually pull him to safety, thereby giving me a moment of true, meaningful interactivity. But guess what? Eli falls to his death anyway. But oh wait, never mind. Here comes a Vortigaunt to rescue Eli. It was in this very moment that the glass was shattered, the curtains were torn away, and I saw Half-Life Alyx for what it truly was. This game is not a virtual world in any respect, but rather a theme park ride. A very impressive theme park ride, mind you, probably the most detailed and complicated theme park ride that mankind has ever created, but a theme park ride nevertheless. From this point forward, the game felt all too predictable, and aside from simply begging for the sweet release of death, I felt as though I was spending the entire game just waiting for something to happen. Just waiting for that instant of genius, that white-knuckle moment where the point of interactivity was clear, and I could finally stand behind this game and say, yes, that was awesome. That is what VR is all about. But in the end, that moment never came for me. Every time I tried to push the boundaries of interactivity, the game slapped my hand and said, no, you cannot do that. So in the end, Half-Life Alyx is just a meager affectation of the games that came before it. And that is why I say that Half-Life Alyx is a failure of game design. At this point, my discussion of gameplay is over with, so if you're someone who's still trying to evaluate whether or not you should buy Half-Life Alyx for the gameplay, hopefully my critique will have given you enough information to make a decision. In that case, you can probably safely turn off this video. Before I dive deep into the story of this game, I'd like to take a brief moment to discuss Valve itself. By now it's no surprise that Valve has a very utilitarian ethos around game design. They have gone on public record saying that they use games to solve interesting problems, or to try to push new technologies. While Valve may spin this as a positive of their company, I think this has a number of unfortunate ramifications. Specifically that, if a project has no utility relative to solving problems or pushing technology, then Valve will only complete the projects that are either necessary or convenient for them to do so. If you look back at the history of Valve, then this conclusion becomes obvious. On the one hand, every game released between Portal 2 and Half-Life Alyx has been either a remake of a mod, a remake of a previous game, or just a small side project, tangential to their larger objectives. On the other hand, controversies like the Team Fortress 2 market crash and the absolute dumpster fire of Hunt Down the Freeman show that Valve often won't go beyond the bare minimum of action. But for me, the most poignant lesson came when Mark Laidlaw, the former Valve writer of Half-Life, finally published his Epistle 3, a brief synopsis of how the Half-Life story should have ended. Now, I will be forever grateful that Mark chose to give the community this closure. That being said, the fact that he chose to publish Epistle 3 speaks volumes. If Mark believed that Valve was truly capable of concluding the Half-Life story, then he would have never published his Epistle 3. By that I mean, any theoretical Half-Life 2 Episode 3 would have no utility for solving problems or pushing technology, nor would it be necessary or convenient for Valve to create such a conclusion. On the other hand, Valve won't ever publicly cancel a Half-Life 3, because the IP of Half-Life may prove to have some kind of utility later on. And herein lies the reason of why Half-Life has spent 13 years on hiatus. Technically not cancelled, but also not cancelled. In case it weren't already obvious, I completely disagree with this utilitarian view of video games. I disapprove because it leads to an unhealthy relationship with your community, and I disapprove because games aren't great because they push technology. Half-Life was not great because it pushed technology. It was great because it codified the idea of an ergodic narrative within video games. Lastly, I disapprove because I believe in the concept of what I shall refer to as the maxim of artistic integrity, which is just a pretentious way of saying that if you create a story, you should always endeavor to conclude that story. Yet, Valve has chosen an ethos of game development which plants them in direct opposition of this maxim. And I know some of you will say that, well, Valve just released a Half-Life game, so you're obviously wrong. But here's the thing. I posit that the content of a story is always some kind of indicator of authorial intent, or in the case of video games, designer intent. And before I sat down to play Half-Life Alyx, I figured that the story would lie between one of two extremes. Either the story would be a faithful narrative, one that sat nicely within the Half-Life continuity, answering some interesting questions in a plausible manner, or that it would be a subversive narrative, one that redefined the story of Half-Life, all in the name of pushing that VR technology. If the former were the case, then perhaps it could be plausible that Valve would be changing their ways, so that they could finally conclude the story of Half-Life. If the latter were the case, then nothing will have changed, and thus Half-Life may never reach that conclusion. So, with that in mind, let's dive deep into the story of Half-Life Alyx. Fair warning, as I am going to spoil every bit of this narrative that I have not spoiled already. The premise of this game is that we are Alyx Vance, 5 years before the events of Half-Life 2 and the episodes. Now I have to stop right here because we already have a big problem. Valve has already stated that this game is the next step in the Half-Life story, but how could that be the case when this game is a prequel? Right off the bat, this already raised 1,000 red flags in my mind, but let's just ignore that for a moment and continue forward. Starting off, we get a message from our dad Eli and this other guy Russell, saying that they found some unusual piece of Combine technology, and that Alyx needs to come take a look. So we do that, except oh no, here come the Combine. Both Eli and Alyx are arrested. Luckily enough, that Russell guy rescues Alyx, but not Eli. Which is bad, because the Combine are going to interrogate Eli and then suck out his brains, so we need to stop that. Which we do accomplish at the end of the first act of this game, to which Eli reveals that the data he found was actually a superweapon. We don't know what it is, but it's probably really bad. So our goal for the rest of the game is to take down this superweapon. So that's the overall premise of the game. Let's stop for a moment and nitpick a few details. First of all, there's the topic of the Citadel itself. Apparently, the story is that the Combine teleported in half of the Citadel, and is now building the rest on Earth manually. But that's kinda stupid. I figure that the process of invading another universe would be roughly analogous to humanity trying to colonize another planet. So if you're going to colonize an alien environment, it makes no sense to only bring half of the materials you need to establish yourself. So the Combine finishing the Citadel on Earth seems like a gamble to me, because you run the risk of not having the materials you need, and the fact that the locals might try to disrupt your progress. So really, if you have the resources of this Combine overworld, and you have this power of teleportation, Why not teleport a complete, fully functional citadel with all of the amenities you need to establish yourself on this planet? Does not make a lot of sense to me. Next, we have the topic of what the hell did they do to those Striders? Looking back at past Half-Life games, it's clear that each Combine machine seems well designed around a particular task. Specifically, we have the Striders, which are an alien interpretation of war elephants. A deadly force multiplier designed to level entire city blocks single-handedly. Now the Striders seem to be retrofitted for construction? But why though? You already have helicopters and dropships, as well as spaceships with magical tractor beams. Why would you retrofit the Striders for this role, when you already have plenty of other tools that are more specialized for this role? Using the Striders in this manner makes about as much sense as me trying to get those old world war elephants to lay down the fiber optic cable in my house. Let's not forget this moment where the Strider just nonchalantly breaks these power cables. My biggest nitpick, however, is with regards to those Combine fabricators. You know, those machines where you stick your gun in order to get those upgrades. Now, in reality, what we have here is almost on the level of a Star Trek replicator. Assuming that you have enough resin, you could, in principle, fabricate any machine you wanted. Yeah, sure, Russell gives an offhand remark how it wouldn't work on the gravity gloves. But really, if someone reverse engineered these fabricators, there's really no good reason why you couldn't fabricate gravity gloves en masse, or any other weapon for that matter. This is a massive problem, because I figure that one of the reasons the Combine managed to overtake Earth in under 7 hours is because they have technological superiority. But if you're just going to leave all of these fabricators lying around in the quarantine zone, there's no reason that someone in the Resistance couldn't reverse engineer them in order to fabricate a massive pile of weapons. And what do you know, you have a perfect storm for humanity to launch a massive resistance. I mean, all of this talk about we must stop the superweapon, when really these fabricators are the superweapons. So on one hand, the fact that the Combine have left all of this technology lying around in the quarantine zone makes them look stupid, but also the fact that nobody in the Resistance has tried to reverse engineer these machines makes them look stupid. So yeah, everyone's just kinda stupid, I guess. And if you're wondering why I'm even bothering to point out these nitpicks, allow me to pose this question. What are the themes of Half-Life? What is the story of Half-Life about? For me, I think one of the most obvious answers would be the misuse or ill use of technology. It was the misuse of technology that started the whole resonance cascade in Half-Life 1. We know that the empire of the Combine is built upon the continuous abuses of technology, and part of the central conflict of Episode 2 revolves around the Borealis, another piece of technology with the potential to be misused. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Half-Life is a story bereft of plot holes, but in regards to Half-Life Alyx, it seems to me that Valve put almost no thought into the implications of technology, like those fabricators. While the central conflict of Alyx does indeed revolve around a super weapon, it turns out that, spoiler alert, that angle is actually a red herring. So in the end, Half-Life Alyx ultimately forgets about that theme of the misuse of technology, which I find to be a supreme case of irony, given that Alyx itself was intended to push technology of VR. Yet because the gameplay of Alyx is just so tedious to begin with, the game once again comes full circle in being a cautionary tale against the misuse of technology. Furthermore, this relates into another problem I have, in that the Combine just aren't that threatening. Sure, they may look pretty scary and sound pretty scary. They've got the big, scary robots and the big, scary police guys, but they don't feel like an existential threat. See, the storytelling in Half-Life 2 is still effective to this day because of the subtlety of its world building. It doesn't hit you right off the bat with the immediacy of the big, scary Combine. Rather, it builds the tension by revealing the societal malaise that has set in among the citizens of City 17, pushing so many near their breaking points. Chapters like Ravenholm and Highway 17 are substantial because they reveal the cruel outreach of the Combine, that they are a force that may destroy an entire civilization, or even an entire planet. but Alyx seems to eschew this style of storytelling with more Hollywood-level bombast. This topic of poor world building is actually part of a larger problem in Alyx, namely that this game goes against the all-important principle of show, don't tell. 90% of the exposition in this game comes from characters just talking to you, with most of the important stuff coming from either Russell or Eli over the radio. This is a dire flaw, which cascades into countless other issues. First off, having characters constantly explain things to you removes so much of the wonder and tension of exploration that existed in past games. When Russell says, "Oh, watch out for that barnacle," or "watch out for that headcrab," it is so much less powerful than the scenes in Half-Life 2, where the game shows you the threat of these creatures without saying a single word. Second of all, by relying upon telling and not showing, the player cannot get an appreciable feeling of the stakes of this story. The Citadel in Half-Life 2 and the episodes is a potent symbol because it is a constant visual reminder of what Gordon Freeman is up against, be that a symbolic threat or a literal threat. When Barney says, "You better get out of City 17, it's not just a matter of him telling you what you need to do, but rather you see directly in front of you that the Combine are about to send everything they have to hunt you down. Half-Life Alyx is not like that. Russell says that the Combine will suck out Eli's brains if we don't rescue him, but we're never shown what that actually means. We're never shown why this super weapon is supposed to be such a threat. It's just a hypothetical, well, it looks bad and the Combine have it, so we better stop them." This reliance upon telling instead of showing actually causes Alyx to repeat a major problem of past Half-Life games. By that I mean, the characters are only there to serve a function of the plot and nothing else. There are at least 4 or 5 occasions in Alyx where a character will come along, give exposition, and then leave never to be seen again. I get that this may not be an issue for most of you, but for me, the fact that Half-Life Alyx has made no progress in terms of its character writing is a supreme disappointment. At the very least, the throwaway characters in Half-Life 2 actually had the courtesy of being interesting, like Father Grigori.
I am Father Grigori. You have already met my congregation.
This guy has more personality than every character in Half-Life Alyx combined. But as far as characters are concerned, the absolute largest issue is that of Alyx Vance herself. The root cause of my problem with Alyx is the fact that she is a voiced protagonist. To be clear, this has nothing to do with the voice actress being changed. I do think that is a problem, but this video is already long enough, so I'm not going to get into that. Rather, like I mentioned in my first video, a voiced protagonist is a massive diegesis problem. A silent protagonist is designed to make the player feel like a diegetic element of the game world, which is a substantial asset to the process of immersion. But the moment you give your protagonist a voice, you create the possibility that the motivations of the character will be different than the motivations of the player. No longer are you, the player, a diegetic character in this world, but rather just an observer, riding along inside the mind of this other character. And yes, if we're going to be perfectly pedantic about this, every other flat-screen game with a voiced protagonist does have this same issue. But we're talking about Half-Life Alyx, a virtual reality game. By the very nature of the medium, the level of reality is different. Everything about VR is designed to make you feel immersed in this world, to make you feel diegetic. But the moment you give your protagonist a voice, you overwrite so much of that potential to create immersion, in a manner which almost ruins the experience for me. But if you're still convinced that this is all just pretentious guff, then let me give you an example. Consider this moment, when you first meet the brain-damaged Vortigaunt. Now, I will give credit where it's due. The developers did a fantastic job bringing the Vortigaunt to life here. At this moment, I was quite intrigued. I wanted to hear everything this Vortigaunt had to say. But Alyx Vance? No, Alyx wanted nothing to do with him. She basically says, "Nope, sorry, I don't want to talk to you right now, I gotta go rescue my dad." This is exactly what I mean by a diegesis problem. I wanted to do one thing, but the player character wanted to do another. Therefore, I could never properly feel like I was Alyx Vance, which frustrated me to no end. As for the character of Alyx Vance, I gotta say she doesn't really feel like Alyx. The Alyx Vance I remember was a smart, talented young woman, capable of great empathy and kindness. She was a great character. But the Alyx of Half-Life Alyx is nothing like this. Again, think about that moment with the brain-damaged Vortigaunt. She is all but ready to just blow him off without a second thought, and afterwards she effectively says that, "Wow, those Vortigaunts, they sure are a bunch of weirdos, aren't they?" Not at all the same character that might kiss a Vortigaunt in Episode 2. And one might give the critique that, well, it's just a character arc thing, she'll develop into that character later on. And that might be a valid criticism. One problem. There are no character arcs in Half-Life Alyx. Half-Life 2, even despite the fact that it has somewhat flat characters, does have some character arcs. Consider the moment when you arrive at Black Mesa East. We can see that there's a bit of a rivalry between Alyx and Mossman. This reaches a climax in Nova Prospekt, when we learn that Mossman is a double agent for the Combine. Finally, in the penultimate scenes of the game, Mossman shows her true colors, and is able to free all of the good guys, which allows her and Alyx Vance to put their differences behind them. It's not a particularly complicated character arc, but it does work. Even good old cranky pants Dr. Magnuson has something of a character arc, where he learns to respect Gordon enough to finally suck up his pride and offer a sincere thank you. Half-Life Alyx has nothing. The only meaningful shred of conflict in this game is probably with regards to Russell's pistol, which basically boils down to Russell saying, "Hey, that's my pistol, you better give that pistol back." To which Alyx says, "Your pistol? No, dude, this is my pistol." It's just a petty squabble that goes nowhere. But perhaps worse than all of that is that Alyx Vance is a protagonist with no agency. Part of this problem goes back to what I said earlier about the game telling instead of showing. But there is another problem that Alyx's actions do not result in any satisfying sequence of setups or payoffs, which largely holds true for every other character in this game. I hate to sound like a broken record, but once again, Half-Life 2 shows us the answer. Think about Nova Prospekt. We see and hear the name Nova Prospekt dropped at the beginning of the game. Later on, Alyx has a communication with Gordon to say, "Hey, I need your help, they took my dad to Nova Prospekt." So now we have a car, we have a map, we have an objective to get to Nova Prospekt. And then later on, Gordon finally lays siege to Nova Prospekt, after which Nova Prospekt is eventually destroyed. This big attack is awesome not merely because of gameplay, but because it is paying off information that was set up earlier in the game, and the fact that we spent nearly the entirety of 2 chapters actively traveling to Nova Prospekt. Consider this moment where the Vortigaunt rescues Eli. This follows after that other scene, where Alyx gives a half-hearted promise that she will help the Vortigaunts. It looks like a setup and payoff, but it's not, because it doesn't feel like Alyx is making a genuine promise to these Vortigaunts. So when he does show up, it's just kinda lucky, I guess. It's payoff, but with no real setup. There's also the issue of the Northern Star. The Vort says, "Look to the Northern Star, because that's where the plot is," and then, half an hour later, we just stumble upon this Northern Star Hotel. It's a setup, but without a satisfying payoff, because we didn't know that we were going here in the first place. We just conveniently bump into it, because the plot needs us to be here. I already mentioned that one scene earlier, how you were unable to rescue Eli from that pit. But it bears reminding that in this moment, the game is telling you, the player, and Alyx Vance, that you have no agency. But if games are ergodic narratives, if the purpose of games is to give the player agency, then this moment right here is one of the worst design choices that Valve could ever have made. And, to top it all off, we get this comment from Russell.
I hesitate to even bring it up, but I did notice that when you reached out for your father's hand, had he actually grabbed it, his grip would have crushed all the delicate sensors in the Russells.
Ah, okay.
Totally understandable, and would have been worth it, by the way, in this case.
Right.
Having said that, I have a hard time imagining another situation where that would have been the case. And much like your father, the Russells are priceless. Okay, so just, moving forward.
It's almost as if the game designers are saying, "Oh gee, it sure is a good thing we never added a moment of true interactivity in this game. That would have been a total disaster." Which reminds me, this game was written by Eric Wolpaw, the same guy who wrote Portal 2. That game was just overflowing with jokes. So, Half-Life Alyx is filled with jokes. Jokes about resin, jokes about vodka, jokes about employment, jokes about eating headcrabs. So many countless jokes that are aggressively unfunny, and which ruin any sense of tension this game has. I think I may have chuckled a grand total of 3 times in this game, with all of those times related to the first Vortigaunt you meet. Every other joke I just did not care for. And there were a few, like the one comment I mentioned before, to which I found to be in supremely bad taste. But the absolute worst joke in the game comes at this moment. After all of the BS of maneuvering around Jeff, you finally kill him, and then Alyx says this.
Oh my god, Jeff, are you okay?
It was in this moment that I lost all sympathy for Alyx Vance. I know what you're about to say, and yes, Alyx Vance did make some jokes in the past Half-Life games, but only when it was appropriate to do so, because the past Alyx Vance was always conscientious of the gravitas of the danger around her. She was not cracking jokes all the damn time. Consider this moment in Episode 1, after you shut down the Combine reactor core.
Gordon, you did it! The containment system's back in place. It won't last forever, but at least we bought a little time.
This is a genuine character moment, because she is happy that the reactor is stable and that her friend didn't die in the process. If this moment in Episode 1 had been given the writing quality of Half-Life Alyx, then instead of this genuine reaction, we'd probably get something to the effect of, "Wow, Gordon, there sure was a lot of radiation in that reactor core. I sure hope you weren't sterilized in there." I truly wish this were an exaggeration, but this is honestly not a far cry from the quality of writing in this game. Herein lies the death of a once great character, Alyx Vance, now devolved into a smug, self-congratulatory brat, bled dry of all pathos, because Eric Wolpaw decided this game needed some jokes. Fantastic. With that out of the way, I'm going to try to summarize the remainder of the plot. So we find this Northern Star Hotel, where it turns out the Vortigaunts are captured in order to power these conduits that are keeping this vault levitating in the sky. We disconnect this one vault, free the Vortigaunt, after which he says, "Don't worry, Alyx Vance. We'll go take care of the rest of the cables. You just make sure you're in position when that vault comes down." And yet I can't help but feel that Alyx Vance is losing her agency. We get that god-awful encounter with Jeff. Nighttime comes, so at last, with all of the cables disconnected now, we're going to get a great payoff with the vault crashing to the ground. But oh no, guess what? The Combine have a backup tractor beam we need to take out, because Valve decided that we needed to pad out the runtime of this game. Then Eli conveniently provides this bit of exposition.
Prison.
What now?
Wait, Dad, what?
It's not a vault. It's a prison. They didn't build it to keep us out. They're trying to keep something in.
That's an odd revelation. Why should this vault be considered to be a prison? It turns out we shall conveniently get an answer when we conveniently stumble upon random Combine lady, who just so happens to be having a conversation about what is in this vault. Hey, wait a minute. A guy who survived Black Mesa? Raised holy hell and disappeared? That's no mere super weapon they have locked up in there. It's Gordon Freeman! Except, well, now we have another problem. This relates back to an older storytelling problem in Half-Life 2. It seems that Gordon Freeman has become widely regarded as some kind of legendary folk hero.
And yet unsophisticated minds continue to imbue him with romantic power, giving him such dangerous poetic labels as the one free man, the opener of the way.
Yet no explanation is ever given as to why Gordon is such a legend. Granted, he may be important to the Vortigaunts with regards to liberating them from the Annihilanth, but that doesn't necessarily mean that humanity should have a reason to follow him. Speaking within the context of Half-Life 2, however, this doesn't bother me that much. Yet I feel that Half-Life Alyx, given that it is a prequel, should at least attempt to explain this angle. Yet no substantial explanation is ever truly given. Everyone, including Alyx, just assumes that he's an awesome guy who needs to be rescued. Alyx Vance, therefore, has no personal motivation to actually rescue Gordon Freeman. In the end, it only matters because only the player knows who Gordon Freeman is. Because, in past games, the player was Gordon Freeman. Which is to say nothing about why Gordon Freeman is even here, as opposed to being held in stasis by the G-Man. At this point, I kinda knew what was coming. My worst fears had been all but confirmed. But let's keep going. At long last, we climbed to the top of this tower to finally bring down this vault by randomly throwing switches. Which, I gotta say, is not a positive case study in player agency. Afterwards, we get our final boss fight with the Strider. We are then sucked into the vault, after which we get the penultimate sequence, which I describe as the trippy, abstract Bioshock Infinite style ending. You might say, Bioshock Infinite, that's an odd comparison to make. Why would you compare the ending of this game to the ending of Bioshock Infinite? You'll see shortly. At long last, we're at the heart of the vault, where we finally release the prisoner, and, oh no, guess what? That's not Gordon, but rather G-Man. Way to subvert my expectations there, Valve. G-Man goes on to explain that his job entails nudging the timeline in one direction or another whenever it is necessary, to which he shows Alyx a vision of the future. You guessed it, it's the ending of Episode 2, where Eli Vance dies horribly in Alyx's arms. G-Man then gives Alyx a choice to release her father. And I say choice in massive air quotes here, because there is no choice. Back in Half-Life 1, when the G-Man offered Gordon a deal, that was an actual choice. You could, if you wanted to, refuse his deal. It was kind of a shitty choice, but a choice nonetheless. But here, there is no choice. You cannot refuse him, you cannot commit suicide or anything. All you can do is free Eli from his fate, because, once again, Alyx Vance is a protagonist with no agency. G-Man then puts Alyx into stasis to be his next employee. After the credits, we see the final results. Eli lives, Alyx Vance is gone, and the crowbar is once again passed to Gordon Freeman. So hey, everything's good now, right? Gordon is back, Half-Life 3 is confirmed. What an awesome ending, right guys? No, of course not. First of all, this ending completely ruins the G-Man for me. Part of the mystique of the G-Man was that he was an entity whose motives were completely alien to us. But now that he's straight up explaining his motivations, and the fact that he can even be captured at all, it completely destroys any feeling of mystery around him. Second of all, if this is some kind of retroactive time travel, then this ending is rife with paradoxes. I mentioned Bioshock Infinite earlier because almost every flaw in the ending of that game can be used to apply to the ending of this game. I won't go into further detail because this video is long enough. Instead, I'll simply redirect you to Matthew Matosis's critique of Bioshock Infinite. Otherwise, the implication here is that Alyx's deal with G-Man had been in effect all along, which means Eli's death never really happened. That is a colossal problem, however, because Eli's death was a diegetic event. It actually did happen. Yet the ending of Half-Life Alyx seems to imply that that ending is non-diegetic. It didn't actually happen. If so, then I must draw the conclusion that Gordon Freeman is an unreliable narrator, which in turn means that we the players are unreliable narrators. Which is totally anathema to the idea of an ergodic narrative, that we, the players, have some level of meaningful influence over a video game narrative. If so, then why bother? Why bother playing video games at all, when the experiences of the player aren't meant to be real on some level? For all of their great advances in technology, it is clear to me that Valve does not have a goddamn clue as to what an actual video game narrative is supposed to be about. This has dire implications for the themes of Half-Life. I already mentioned that other theme of the misuse of technology, But really, the biggest theme of Half-Life is that of the consequences of choices. You know, that whole unforeseen consequences thing. But at this stage, there are no more consequences, because if G-Man doesn't like how the timeline turns out, then he can just give it a nudge in one direction or the other, to maintain whatever status quo he wants. This implication also applies directly to Valve itself, because the moment you open the door for time travel retcons, you essentially give yourself a creative get-out-of-jail-free card. If that's what Valve wants, then Half-Life will never reach a conclusion, and if Valve wants to push technology or to solve interesting problems, then Half-Life will always be at their beck and call. Thus, the status quo for Valve is completely maintained. As much as I want to say that this is a surprise, honestly, it is not. Ever since Mark Laidlaw wrote his Epistle 3, I was almost certain that Valve would do anything to avoid concluding Episode 2. That future is now a reality. I was 100% correct, and that is no consolation. I am terrified to imagine what Valve will do next for Half-Life. Yet there is a final cherry adorning the top of this delicious cow pie. This may be taking things a bit too far, but I can't help but feel that there's a bit of venomous subtext in these final scenes of Half-Life Alyx. To give you an idea of what I'm thinking, replace G-Man with Valve, Alyx with modern gaming communities, and Gordon with the Half-Life fanbase, and you have a shockingly uncanny allegory for Valve's intentions for VR. So let's hear what G-Man has to say here.
Would be a considerably large nudge. Too large, given the interests of my employers.
Oh, you mean like how Episode 3 might be too big of a nudge?
I could offer you something you don't know you want.
In other words, we, the community, didn't even know that we wanted VR. Is that about right?
The previous hire has been unable or unwilling to perform the tasks laid before him.
So if the Half-Life community is Gordon Freeman, then you're implying that we are unable or unwilling to follow the next chapter of Half-Life? No, Valve. No. We were not unable or unwilling in any regard. We've been sitting here, waiting patiently, theorizing, making fan games, expressing our passion for Half-Life for over a decade now. The fault does not in any way lie with us. You're the ones who were unable and unwilling to create Episode 3. You're the ones who left the community in the dark for over a decade. You're the one that's forcing the medium of virtual reality, thereby forcing so many people behind. And now you have the gall to turn it on us? To say that the community just doesn't know that it wants VR. They're just unable and unwilling. That has got to be the most fallacious, insulting, disrespectful attempt at gaslighting your own fanbase I have ever seen. If that's all you've got, if this was your big attempt of showing the world that Half-Life needs VR, then I say you have failed. Half-Life Alyx is a failure, because now I have lost all interest, not only in the platform of virtual reality, but also in any future game title you may develop. I am done with you, Valve. I am done. I know I'm going to get slammed hard for being just some entitled crybaby who didn't get his Episode 3. Look guys, here's the thing. Valve is going to do whatever it wants regardless of what I say. In fact, I doubt Valve will even look at this video. So in the end, I'm not even going to ask for an Episode 3. I don't need it, I don't want it, and Valve is not obligated to give it to me. All I'm saying is that this mantra of pushing technology and solving problems put above genuine storytelling is only going to do more damage in the long run, not just for Half-Life, but also for any Valve IP. If that is going to be Valve's business, then I no longer care to do business with their games. That's just how it is, and it's nothing personal. If you've made it this far, and I truly appreciate it if you have, then I have one final piece of advice. Stop worshipping Valve. I firmly believe the reason that Half-Life Alyx is the way it is because Valve has internalized this narrative that they can do no wrong. And if we continue to worship them, to throw praise at them, to investigate them, and to data mine and speculate on every bit of game development they may do, then that will only embolden that narrative of Valve can do no wrong. I know this is a difficult ask, because many of you are deeply passionate about Valve. Some of you have even made careers about investigating Valve. But if no one is going to think critically about Valve, then I doubt they will ever truly improve. If there is one point I'd want anyone to take away from this video, it's that we need to have healthier relationships with the art that we consume. Part of that involves not worshipping game companies. And part of that may involve learning when to let go of a franchise. Because Half-Life, Half-Life 2, and its episodes were great games. They are great games. And they will always be great games. But the Valve that made those games is gone, and they're not coming back. But if it is closure that we want, and deep down I want that too, but if that's what we want, then we've got to be the ones to do it. And in that regard, we already have the greatest gift possible. Mark Laidlaw's Epistle 3, a foundation for the community to finish Episode 3. With that in mind, I encourage any of you to go support projects like Project Borealis and Boreal Aleph, because I believe that these projects are the best chance we have for a conclusion to Half-Life. So, as for me, I'm going to go ahead and delete Half-Life Alyx from my account, because I know I'm never going to want to play it, or talk about it, or think about it ever again. And if things keep going as they are, it will be the last Valve game I ever purchase.